Okay, I think we'll get going. Welcome to everyone who is joining us online. This is session 9 of a 10 series webinar on the abolition of the death penalty. Our theme for session 9 is the sociological perspectives. The death penalty is deeply embedded within sociological and socio-legal structures of power that shape its justification, administration, and endurance. A sociological inquiry into this sanction is essential to understanding the complexity of the state's use of lethal force and its connection to broader regimes of inequality. Personal narratives and lived experiences reveal that capital punishment disproportionately targets marginalized and financially disadvantaged social, racial, and identity groups, thereby reproducing systemic hierarchies of privilege and exclusion. These dynamics expose how state violence is legitimized and sustained through institutionalized discourses of justice and security. This session situates the death penalty within critical social theories, examining it as a site where class, race, and state authority converge to uphold the state's hegemonic power. Our session today will begin with a personal narrative from Solmaz Alizadeh. Solmaz was born and raised in Tehran, Iran. She completed her bachelor's and master's degree in biophysics at the University of Tehran before immigrating to Canada in 2003 and settling in Toronto. She continued her academic journey at the University of Toronto, earning a Master of Science in Pharmacology in 2004. She is currently Senior Manager of Market Access at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Her father, Mahmoud Alizadeh, was a political prisoner arrested in the early 1980s and executed during the mass killings of the summer of 1988. Solmaz has been an outspoken advocate for recognition of the 1988 massacre and has shared her father's story and her own experience as a family member of one of the victims at various events and public forums. Thank you, Solmaz, for joining us today. The microphone is yours.
Hello, thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Samira John, for the introduction. And I also thank a special thanks to the organizers of this panel to invite me to speak in this panel. Yes, as Samira mentioned, my father, Mahmoud Alizadeh, was a prominent lawyer who was working at the central bank at a time, and he was arrested in early 80s, actually to give you the precise date, was actually 1983, when he was arrested from a work meeting at National Bank that he was working at that time. And his only crime was basically his affiliation with a lefty organization called Fadayan Khalq, with communist basically ideology. So he was arrested, and initially he was sentenced his sentence was light. It was like just 2 years. We as a family, and also I was just a child, at that time, we didn't really think that, we were not very worried as per se, and we just thought it was a light sentence and 2 years would pass by and he would be released. But unfortunately, after the 2 years, he was not released, and because he refused to do the interviews on the TV or basically declare in a letter that he no longer believed in the communist ideology. For him, it was humiliating. So he stayed in prison for another 3 years until he was executed along with other political prisoners in the mass killings of 1988. So I'm sure all the panelists in this group, they were aware that 1988 massacre is one of the greatest crimes against humanity. And in fact, it was actually recognized as crime against humanity by the Canadian Parliament in 2013, which was a result of the advocacy and all the work of the political activists, of the families of the victims, lawyers, and anyone who was working basically about human rights in Iran, in Canada at that time. Yes, so this is my story, and I don't know if Samira John, you have any other question you want me just to get into how it has impacted my life, or
Yeah, I mean, we're interested in knowing how it's impacted your life,
Okay.
how it's impacted your family, and really what you would like to see in terms of accountability for this mass crime.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So, I mean, I can just start by saying that when we speak about capital punishment, like executions, death penalty, in its general term, like I'm not even talking about, this is the probably the worst example that we can say about political activism, which is completely different level. Like we're not even talking about criminals, or we're talking about basically political dissidents and activists, and um, basically people who believed in a different ideology, or they did know were not in agreement with the regime or the government that is ruling the country. But we often speak in like legal, um, political terms, and not so much, in my opinion. I think all the work that so far has been, and been just more focused on the maybe more like a from sociological perspective of how the capital punishment, it breaches all the human rights. We all know that, right? Like we all know that it breaches human rights, and it's actually in as Amnesty International, it also says like it is the against all the rights of the like a universal declaration of human rights, which was adopted by UN in 1948. But what is missing is actually those untold stories, or if that, even if the stories that have been told, the personal stories, people that the families of the victims who have lived through that experience, those I think has not been told enough. Because for us, like for me and for my family, it was not about, we would at that time, we were not really thinking about the capital punishment, how wrong it is, that it shouldn't be any capital punishment, besides the fact that my father was innocent and all that, so on. It was just that single moment of loss, that when my mother had to break the news, the most devastating news to me, in an indirect way that I was completely unable to understand and grasp. Like as a 13-year-old girl, I did not understand what capital punishment and death penalty was. All I knew that was my innocent father was executed. And it came as a shock to me because nobody was expecting that. And this is a story basically that how it impacted my life from all the aspects of my life and my family's life, like uh, all the great milestones that were missed, by my father, the birthdays, achievements, and everything, university graduation. And on top of that, growing up, I think the worst part, if I want to focus on, will be the silence, that deadly silence that we had to live with, and we have to accept it. Because when the news was brought out to us, like when my father's belongings, for example, was sent to our house in 1988 after the massacre, initially my mother and my family, they did not tell me the story, and they hid it from me because I was in the middle of my exams, and I was a very good student too in the school. So for the longest time, my mother was trying to tell me indirectly, but I was still not getting it, even though I know that like the visits for prison, they have been stopped for several months, which was again strange. But I don't know, maybe in my childish, innocent mind, I was not expecting anything unpleasant, let alone this devastating. So my mom actually found like a very interesting way of telling me, breaking the news to me, by making a reference to the movie, to a 1985 movie called Chrysanthemums, which was revolved around like death and execution. And I just remember that after that, when we had the conversation, maybe I couldn't even cry. Like in my initial response was shock, which is psychologically, it's one of the worst actually feelings that you can actually experience. Because when you can grieve, you can cry, you can express your emotions. I think it helps easing the burden. But I did not even have that luxury. I did not even have that advantage. I remember that the conversation with my mother, that you understand that your father was a political prisoner. He was not a criminal. He was innocent. But we're still living in this country. This country is still run by Islamic Republic, ruled by Islamic Republic. You will not speak about this in school, except obviously the close, very close friends, like my circle of, like, in fact, interestingly, I had a friend whose father was executed right at the beginning of the revolution. So he was he was basically affiliated with the former government, and he was just executed. And he had a younger sister whose mother was pregnant with her sister when her father was executed. So basically, the younger sister never saw her father. So except these small group of people, including this friend of mine, nobody else knew. And in school, I had to just complete silence. So no chance to grieve, to cry, nothing. And I remember that even when I was in high school, because high school, the high school system at that time was different actually than here. So we had like 5 years elementary school, 3 years guidance school, 4 years high school. When I was in the third grade of high school, basically 1 year before graduating, getting my diploma, high school diploma, I participated in the scientific competition at the province level, Tehran, and I was basically number one. And I became number one. I came as number one. And if I tell you what the school gave me as a gift, it will be shocking, and I don't even know how to describe it. So first of all, they gave me just a digital calculator along with a big frame like poster of Khomeini that was framed. So basically the killer of my father, because the massacre of 1988, as everyone knows, was like it started and initiated by the direct rule of Khomeini. Like his letter is actually, even with his signature, is actually on the social media. If you look for it, you can find it. So I just don't even remember like how I carried that photo home and like holding it the other side. And then I just went home, and then my mother was shocked. She said, "What is this?" I'm like, "Whoa, this is an award. They awarded me." So obviously, we tear it apart and we throw it away. But living through that silence and not grieving, like I didn't grieve my father's unjust death and execution until 2012, believe it or not, when I was already in Canada. I immigrated to Canada in 2003. And I actually came on a visitor visa because I had to, the research work that I was doing at Tehran University was accepted for a poster presentation at a conference here. And when I came with the intention of staying. So then while I was on a student visa, I applied to University of Toronto. I got admission for a master's of pharmacology, and I became a student. And after I got work visa, and then I went through immigration and citizenship. And basically, I've gone through all the different visas in Canada. So until 2012, what happened in 2012 that I started just like grieving for my father's death? So see how many years after 1988 was that when a few of my father's cellmates who had miraculously survived a massacre contacted me on social media. One of them being a very prominent advocate and outspoken person about those massacres, who has written so many books, has done all the interviews. Although his interviews, he mostly like shows up in a Persian TV program. He lives in Germany. His name is Mehdi Aslani. And another cellmate who happened to hear my father's last words in front of the death committee. So you can imagine the impact of that psychologically on me. So 2012 was the turning point, as if the clock has gone back for me to 1980s. That required hours, days, months of psychotherapy, just trying medication and everything. So then trying to come back to present. But then until one of my counselors told me that, Solmaz, you are grieving something that you didn't do years ago because you couldn't, because we were forced, silence was enforced on us. We had no other choice but silence. We had to let it go. So you can imagine, it's what this death penalty has done. It doesn't only impact the accused, which was, let's just put it aside for a fact that the accused it was completely unjust, right? My father was completely innocent. And, but it also punishes the families, the loved ones, the children, the wife, the mother. My father when he was a kid, he lost his father. So my grandmother raised him without a father. So you can imagine. And also because he was a figure that was pretty much loved by everyone, he was a people's man. He totally, I might not like agree with his ideology, but like I cannot really judge him by believing in the, the socialist ideology at that time. I think if you go back to 40, 50 years ago, I'm sure all the panelists would agree with me that the intellectual movement was lefty organization. It was lefty ideologies, and so it was communist and socialist ideology. So he got attracted to those because he believed in social justice. I'm sure if he had been given the opportunity to be alive today, maybe he wouldn't believe in those ideologies that he did. But what I'm getting at is that the impact on myself, like years and years of obviously, psychotherapy, depression, and the trauma that you carry. Like I think that I've always been, for example, been told that your outlook on life is negative. Like I try to work on it, but that's just a result of what the impact of my father's execution of me, right? Or the fact that since I was a teenager, I knew that this is a dark world. I do not want to bring any child to this world. I would never want to have a child. So the impact is significant, is huge. And I was also the only child, right? Even though I was overprotected by my mother, but I was still living in that toxic society, right? Being part of the system. So I grew up with rage, anger. So I was always confrontational. Like anything that I could I was a rebel. And I think I still am because it has impacted me. Like, for example, even I've noticed that even when I work in a corporation, there are certain, obviously policies, SOPs, and I always find those SOPs, I want to go around them because I'm a rebel. And it has had its negative impact on me, right? So then to the point that I'm questioning everything. I remember when I was in university, I was in confrontation with Islamic Association. I was always also a target, maybe because my look was a little bit different, a little bit lighter eyes, hair. I don't know. I was always a target by them, always like being questioned by them for my hijab, for this and that. But for me, the confrontation would always turn into like the unjust basic treatment that my family has been endured. So I hope I didn't speak too much, but if I can say in a nutshell, the negative impact has been significant, way beyond that anyone can imagine.
Thank you so much. Merci Solmaz John. Thank you so much, Solmaz.
You're welcome.
It's interesting because we don't often in our community speak about intergenerational trauma.
That's correct.
And how that has gotten passed down because silence meant survival for so
Yes,
many.
exactly.
And that grieving process that you would normally go through wasn't allowed.
That's correct.
And thousands of family members had to grieve in silence. And we see the effects of that today. Thank you so much for
You're more than
sharing your
welcome.
story for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our first panelist for today is Mani Azimzadeh, a member of the Iranian community here in Toronto, who holds a Master of Education in Social Justice Education with collaborative specializations in sexual diversity studies from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, or OISE, at the University of Toronto. Having faced systemic discrimination throughout his youth for refusing to conform to the Islamic Republic's ideological demands, as well as due to his sexual orientation, he became actively engaged in protest movements during his student years and afterward in Iran. Mani left Iran in 2011. As a member of the queer community, Mani became an active contributor to the opposition during the Woman Life Freedom Movement through his work with Simorgh. This is the Iranian queer community in Toronto. He also collaborates with a range of political opposition groups committed to democratic transformation in Iran. Mani also designs educational programming and courses focused on social justice, democratic engagement, and critical approaches to education. He currently serves as a program manager in a Toronto-based nonprofit in the field of social work, where he continues to advance his commitment to social justice within both the Iranian diaspora and the broader Canadian context. Mani, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Samira Jan. I want to first thank Solmaz for this strong narrative. Thank you so much, John. You actually created support for what I'm going to talk about. In addition, I believe that narratives are very important because um, at the end of the day, we have limited experience in our lives where we live, and many of people might have not experienced the fear, the terror that we experienced during the Islamic Republic regime's life in Iran. And when we do not experience discrimination, we might take it easy. We might think that, okay, it's easy to cope with that. But narratives helps us to they help us to understand the burden that people are carrying, and this actually helps us if we want to get together to become one voice against any type of discrimination. Narratives play a very, very important role. Thank you very much so much, John. Every time I hear it, it feels like my heart bleeds like the first time, and I hope that people first are not going to be killed, more people are not going to be murdered, and also people with that experience can can calm their heart, their pain down, and yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to share. I've prepared a very simple. I'm an old man, so I don't know much about technology. I've prepared this very simple um, slideshow. I'm going to share it, and then can you see my slide? Okay, great. Today I would like to look at the execution sentencing not only as a legal matter, but as a profoundly social phenomenon. When a society decides that the state has the authority to take a life, this decision reflects more than a criminal code. It reflects the society's values, power structures, fears, and inequalities. I'm going to have a look at the sociology of execution first as a global phenomenon, and then I will focus on Iran. Sociology asks questions that go beyond what did the person do. We ask who is most likely to receive a death sentence? Why does the state rely on this punishment? What social meaning does execution carry? And how do cultural narratives and political contexts shape its use? Execution sentencing is therefore not only an act of punishment, it's an act of social communication, of political performance, and of moral boundary making. The first slide, I talk about the social distribution of execution. Who is most affected? Samir Rajan touched upon this, but I'm going to elaborate a bit more. One of the strongest sociological patterns we see globally is that execution is not distributed equally across a population. The people most vulnerable to receiving death sentence are rarely the most powerful, the wealthiest, or the most socially connected. However, in the beginning of Islamic regime's life, we had examples that did not follow this pattern. We can talk about that later. Instead, we see consistent patterns. Economic inequality is one of the patterns. People living in poverty have limited access to legal representation, limited ability to post bail, fewer social resources, and less visibility or advocacy. This means their fate is shaped by a structural disadvantage of long before they reach a courtroom. And then we have ethnic and racial minorities across many countries, whether the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, or China. Ethnic minority groups are disproportionately sentenced to death. This tells us something fundamental. Execution interacts with existing social hierarchies, as Samira also touched upon that. It amplifies the inequalities already present. And then we have migrants and socially stigmatized groups, which are often targeted by the system. and they usually lack social protection, these groups. To name them, undocumented migrants, refugees, drug users, people with mental illness, and political dissidents. Of course, there are more to name. These groups are excluded not only from privilege, but from public sympathy. That's very important. Therefore, the death penalty becomes a way for the state to define who belongs and who does not. The sociological takeaway is that execution is not merely a response to crime. It's a reflection of which lives society considers expendable and which lives it considers worth protecting. Next slide talks about execution as a tool of state power and social control. Max Weber famously defined the state as the entity that holds the monopoly of legitimate violence. Execution is the most absolute form of this authority. It's the state saying, we determine whose life can be taken, under what conditions, and for what purpose. Why does the state use this power? Sociologically, execution serves several functions. The first function is maintaining obedience and authority. In many societies, the death penalty is not aimed at rehabilitating individuals, although it claims so, but at reinforcing obedience to state law and state ideology. The message is, there are moral and social lines you do not cross. The other function is suppressing political dissents, which in Iran we see it frequently. In some contexts like Iran, execution is used to eliminate political opposition. Charges may be framed as security threats, religious offenses, or moral corruption, but the sociological function is the same: to silence, to deter, and to demonstrate power. And then the other function is managing public fear. When societies undergo economic, political, or cultural crises, support for the death penalty often increases. People look for symbols of order and stability, and the state responds by presenting harsh punishment as evidence of strength. The other function is constructing moral boundaries. Durkheim argued that punishment is about reaffirming collective values. Execution sends a message. This is who we are, and this is what we do not tolerate. It becomes a ritual through which society reassures itself that moral universe is still intact. Next slide talks about the cultural construction of crime, danger, and deservingness. One of sociology's most important contributions is the idea that crime is not merely an objective reality. It's a social construction. What counts as a capital crime? We can see it. This varies widely. In some countries, drug use. In others, blasphemy. In others, homicide. In others, political protest. In some contexts, same-sex relations historically carried the death penalty. In Iran, all of them, unfortunately. The variability itself demonstrates that the death penalty reflects cultural narratives, not just criminal behavior. We have the label of dangerousness. People are not executed simply because they committed an act. They're executed because the state labels them as dangerous, corrupt, deviant, or threatening to social order. These labels shape punishment more than actions do. And then we have deservingness. Sociologically, society divides people into those whose lives are grievable and those whose lives are considered beyond moral protection. Execution sentencing typically targets those placed in the second category, beyond moral protection. In next slide, I talk about the symbolic dimensions of execution. Execution is always symbolic. It's a performance of state power and social morality. Deterrence as a spectacle. Even if carried out behind prison walls, execution is a public message. It tells people what identity, behavior, or political stance is condemned. When executions are public or televised, this symbolic function becomes even more explicit. And then we have the concept of creating an imaginary of purity. Some legal systems frame execution as a way to cleanse, quote unquote, cleanse society. The idea is not just that a crime has been punished, but that a moral threat has been removed. Then we have reassurance in times of crises. During political unrest or economic instability, states often increase executions to signal stability, competence, and control. Again, the sociological point is this. Executions are rarely about the individual. They are about society's need for order. In next slide, I talk about public opinion, fear, and moral panic. Support for execution is deeply shaped by emotion. Fear of crime, fear of disorder, and fear of the other can all lead to demands for harsher sentencing. There are instances where people opposing a system find some punishments against some groups or communities just or legitimate because those people, the people who are being punished, have disrupted the social norms that these people believe in, so they remain silent. This is how states create accomplices, create enforcers among the people. Now, let's look what drives moral panic. It can be sensationalized media reporting, political rhetoric, economic insecurity, social fragmentation. When people feel unsafe or anxious, they're more likely to return to punishment as a solution. So we have the political use of fear. Politicians may mobilize fear to present themselves as strong leaders. Vote for me, I will be tough on crime. The sociological insight here is that support for death penalty is not only a moral position, it's a response to social anxiety. This is very important for us, like civilian peoples who are not part of the political system. I mean, government and regimes. And then we have comparative lens. I briefly compare here Iran and Western contexts. Without focusing on specific political positions on this slide, we can say sociologically, in Iran, executions are intertwined with religious legal ideology. Certain offenses, political, moral, religious, are constructed as existential threats. And execution sometimes functions as a tool of governance in Iran in moments of unrest. Groups with limited legal power, ethnic minorities, drug users, the poor, gay people, are highly vulnerable. In Western countries, though, the death penalty often reflects race, class, and political geography. It is framed around serious violent crime, yet still reproduces inequality. And then support rises during periods of insecurity or political tension. We have some commonality across contexts. Execution ultimately reflects each society's deepest fears and the lines it draws around morality, identity, and social order. I believe that we are living in an era that we can see the rise of all of these. And then we have sociological pathway toward change. If societies want to reduce reliance on execution, research suggests they must address structural inequality, access to legal defense, transparency and accountability, public education on crime and punishment, reduction of fear-based political narratives, and shifting from punitive to rehabilitative models, because social transformation, not just legal reform, is required. If we have time, Samira Jan, then I can have a bit more detailed look at Iran. Unfortunately, I forgot to.
We do have time. It's up to you. We can either you can tackle that now, or we can tackle that during the panel portion and Q&A. That's up to you.
Okay. Okay, I leave it here for now. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll be here.
Thank you so much, Manijan. This is just a reminder to those who are joining us that you can put your questions, please. We will have a Q&A after, so please put your questions in the Q&A box that is provided here in the Zoom. Our second speaker for today is a name that many of us are familiar with and in many ways needs no introduction, but I will still give her one. Raha Bahraini. Raha is an Iranian-Canadian human rights lawyer with an expertise in international human rights law. Since 2014, she has worked as Amnesty International's researcher on Iran. Before that, she assisted the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. Bahraini's work has engaged with a wide range of human rights issues, including the death penalty, freedom of expression, association and assembly, torture, women's rights, discrimination against minorities, gender identity, and sexual orientation rights and transitional justice. Thank you for joining us, Rahajan. The microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Samira Jan. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here this evening to discuss the situation of the death penalty in Iran. I am sharing our latest findings with you at Amnesty International at a time when the Iranian authorities have waged a horrific assault on the right to life. As we heard from earlier panelists, Iran has always had a major execution crisis with tens of thousands of people executed over the past decades. As the first speaker mentioned, and my deepest solidarities with her and her family, during the 1980s, the Iranian authorities summarily executed tens of thousands of dissidents. Sadly, 4 decades later, we are seeing a spike in execution that we had not seen in the past 4 decades. This year, we have recorded the execution of over 1,500 people, and this is the highest number that Amnesty International has recorded since the end of the 1980s. And we have not even reached the end of the year. So with less than basically a month before the year ends, the number of executions that the authorities carried out has already surpassed the horrific figures that we documented in the earlier years. Since the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, the Iranian authorities have increased their use of the death penalty as a tool of state repression and to crush dissent. They have also increased the use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses, even though under international law, the use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses is absolutely prohibited. Of course, at Amnesty, we oppose the death penalty in all circumstances. But for the authorities to execute hundreds of people every year for drug-related offenses after grossly unfair trials, this just compounds the injustice and cruelty. This ongoing escalation of executions in Iran, which has reached horrific proportions, is because the Iranian authorities are trying to crush dissent and instill a climate of fear and repression in the society. This is a pattern that we have seen time and again in the case of Iran, with authorities escalating their use of the death penalty after periods of nationwide popular protest. We have been asking the international community in recent years to take more firm action with regard to this chilling assault on the right to life. We've been also waging campaigns and advocacy efforts urging the Iranian authorities to impose a moratorium on all executions and to quash the death sentences of those on death row. Tens of thousands of people could be at risk of execution, with announcements from the authorities that they have increased their lethal campaigns in relation to drug trafficking. In addition to the use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses and mass arrests on this front, we continue to see the use of the death penalty in Iran for broad and vaguely defined charges such as enmity against God and corruption on earth and armed rebellion against the state. These are charges that are prosecuted before revolutionary courts, which lack independence and cooperate with intelligence and security bodies to crush dissent against the Islamic Republic system. These types of charges are brought against political dissidents, protesters, and members of ethnic minorities, oppressed ethnic minorities. Since the 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June 2025, we have also seen the escalation of the death penalty under the guise of national security, with these types of charges that I mentioned being brought against those accused of espionage for Israel, again after grossly unfair trials that rely on confessions extracted under torture. The authorities' use of the death penalty in Iran has always disproportionately impacted marginalized minorities, particularly those belonging to the Afghan, Baluchi, and Kurdish and Arab communities in the country. As we speak, 2 Kurdish women are in prison for their peaceful human rights and civil society work. They are Pakshan Azizi, Kurdish humanitarian aid worker, and Kurdish dissident Verisha Moradi. After a major global campaign, Pakshan's case was subjected to a review, but both of these women are at risk of the death penalty and have been on death row for a number of years now. Afghans in Iran, as I mentioned, have also been heavily impacted by the increase in the use of the death penalty. The number of Afghans executed in Iran more than tripled from 25 in 2023 to 80 in 2024. And this coincided with an increase in racist and xenophobic rhetoric from Iranian officials against Afghan refugees and migrants in Iran who are subject to discrimination and violence in the country and who have faced an unprecedented wave of forced mass expulsions to Afghanistan this year. This use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses has particularly impacted Iran's oppressed Baluchi minority. Year after year, this community accounts for around 30 to 40% of drug-related executions in the country, even though they make up about 5% of Iran's population. In 2023, with the execution of 130 Baluchi men and 3 women, 135 Baluchi men and 3 women, they accounted for 29% of all drug-related executions in the country. In 2022, they accounted for 42% of all drug-related executions in the country. And in 2021, they accounted for 34% of all drug-related executions that year. This oppressed minority, the Baluchi minority, resides in Iran's Sistan and Baluchistan province, which is one of the poorest provinces in the country. It has faced significant underdevelopment due to the central government's persistent underinvestment. The authorities have constantly neglected the root causes of involvement in drug-related offenses such as economic deprivation and systematic marginalization, and instead they have resorted to these lethal anti-narcotic policies that impact the most marginalized and impoverished sectors of the Iranian society. We have consistently documented the pattern of the Iranian authorities cruelly executing members of the Baluchi minority in secret without prior notice to their families and lawyers, which shows absolute disregard for life and denies relatives cruelly even final visits. Families usually learn of the authorities having executed their loved ones when they are called by prison authorities to collect the bodies of their loved ones. The victims have included teenagers as young as 18 or 19 years old and elderly men in their 70s. They also include women who face structural discrimination in the country and sometimes accompany under coercion the men involved in drug-related offenses, and they are forced under coercion to make confessions that are then used against them to issue death sentences. As I mentioned, since the 12-day war with Israel, the Iranian authorities have escalated internal repression. Shockingly, they have called for expedited executions and for a repeat of the 1988 prison massacres. As the first panelist already discussed, in 1988, the Iranian authorities ordered the summary and extrajudicial execution of thousands of political prisoners, and for decades to come, they forcibly disappeared these victims in the sense that they continued to conceal their fate and whereabouts. The victims were buried in secret mass graves or unknown individualized graves across the country, and to this day, the whereabouts of most victims from the 1988 prison massacres remains unknown. For this reason, in a landmark report in 2018, which marked the 30th anniversary of the 1988 prison massacres, Amnesty International concluded that the Iranian authorities not only committed the crime against humanity of murder in 1988, but they continue to commit the crime against humanity of enforced disappearance in relation to the 1988 prison massacres up to now. This crime under international law is considered continuing until the day the fate and whereabouts of those killed is fully established. The fact that since June, the Iranian authorities have called for a repeat of the 1988 prison massacres is a shocking admission of the extent to which they are prepared to go in order to create a climate of fear and intimidation in the country and intensify their horrific assault on the right to life. Since the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, already 12 protesters were executed after grossly unfair trials for charges like corruption on earth and armed rebellion against the state, even though the men themselves all consistently denied these charges and involvement in acts of violence, and many other protesters and dissidents remain at risk of execution. For this reason, it is crucial that campaigners and human rights defenders around the world stand in solidarity with those on death row and their families in Iran. There is no independent judiciary inside Iran to hear the calls of victims and their families for justice. People have no recourse to a domestic remedy in order to raise their concerns and to seek truth and justice. In these circumstances, we have seen that only sustained international solidarity and meaningful pressure from the international community can make a difference and can save some lives. Some of the people who were at risk of execution in connection with the 2022 protests were eventually spared the death penalty because of the huge campaigns that Amnesty International, along with other human rights groups, waged in their support. We've been urging the UN to increase its interventions with respect to this massive rise in the number of executions in the country. Sadly, the level of response that we have seen from member states of the UN does not match the gravity of this situation. Iran has always been the second executioner in the world after China, having executed hundreds of people every year. In a way, they've sought to normalize the executions of people for the international community. But this grotesque assault on the right to life must not be treated like business as usual, as hundreds of families mourn their loved ones in Iran this year, and the lives of thousands more are at risk. Even by Iran's own bleak record, this is a very grim moment that demands a serious and coordinated international response and a global solidarity. I therefore very much appreciate that you continue to have these webinars on the death penalty situation in Iran and elsewhere. And I hope that together we can make a difference and hold the Iranian authorities to account for their chilling and despicable assault on the right to life in the country. Amnesty International is committed to continuing its struggle for the right to life until the death penalty is abolished in Iran and globally once and for all. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rahajan. I'm just going to see if because we can begin the Q&A portion. I'm not seeing any questions from anybody in the room here, so I'm going to start with my own questions. If I could come to you, Solmazjan, you mentioned that you didn't really begin the grieving process until 2012, decades after this happened to your father.
Yes.
Is Solmaz here in the room?
Yes, I am. I am here.
And I'm just wondering, decades later, when you're able to sort of theorize about this, what impact did that have on your process of grieving?
Yes, that's a good question. So I know that I briefly just mentioned, but not really. I really did not get into the details. As I said, it started in 2012 by when a few of my father's former cellmates they found me on social media, and what I was told is that when they miraculously basically survived those massacres in 1988, they tried to connect with my mother and they wanted to basically connect with me. But obviously my mother, in order, she wanted to protect me, from anything, right? That would, but just, she did not want me to be in contact with former political prisoners, and we're just talking about early 90s, right? Still, well, the Iranian society was very much suppressive, right? The first actually student uprising happened, it didn't happen until 1998. So for that reason, she just refused to put me in contact with them. So basically that there was years that I was under the impression that all those, my father's cellmates were also executed along with him. I know that a few survived, but because we didn't know anything about it, because one of the important characteristics, Samirajan and the panelists, that I want to really focus on that, and I want to bring your attention to that, is that the secrecy of the 1980 massacre, right? That completely distinguishes from other atrocities that the Islamic Republic has committed. So they wanted just to do it as it was just hidden and nobody would find out about it. But so when my father's friends contacted me, there were so many questions that were on my mind. I was just thinking that, first of all, maybe this not a very pleasant question came to my mind, that why are they alive and my father is dead, first of all, right? So how did they survive? Okay, so there was also initially, there was a little bit of not, I wouldn't say mistrust, but in a way that more like a curiosity, maybe borderline slash mistrust a little bit. But and then for me, I remember, for example, the breaking point, I had a breakdown. So after that, there was a point that I really actually had a breakdown. And the breakdown happened when we were actually at a so-called a fun event. It was a barbecue, a backyard barbecue with, and there was one of my father's former friends that I was almost positive that he was executed, because he was a much higher ranking basically member of the same organization, because they all he was also from the same organization, in fact from the same branch of the same organization. So, and I think he was sentenced to 12 or 13 years. So for me, it was very strange that, that my father would 2-year sentence, like a lighter sentence. How come he didn't survive? And then I realized that, okay, it was really, the whole thing was so random, and even the day that you would just show up in front of the death committee could have an important actual impact on your destiny, death or life. So for me, going through that and reviewing all those things and learning also more about him, the way he answered the questions of the death committee, because like one of those, my father's friends, like he said it so casually, oh yeah, I was with your father, like when we were both like blindfolded, and I heard what he said in front of the death committee. And he said it so casually without even thinking that the psychological impact of that on me, right? So I'm not blaming him, but I'm just saying, you know, like the way and all the mixed emotions that I had to deal with. And like all this, like being angry at some point with my father, that why he knew it. Because for the longest time, we just thought that, okay, he was not aware. Many of those former political prisoners, they were not aware of what destiny they had. Actually, at the beginning, when they saw a committee has come, they were even fooling the prisoners, saying that, oh, some of you will be forgiven, like it will be just released even sooner. And they started, let's not forget that the killings started with the Mujahideen Khalq, with the members of the Mujahideen Khalq, right? And then it expanded to lefties. So, but what I learned in 2012 was that my father knew. My father knew that the way that he was going to answer those questions, it was very, very important, because it would just change his destiny, like from death to life. But he chose to answer the questions in a way that I'm not saying that he chose death, but he did not basically give like a manipulative answer in a way that he did not basically try to save his life. That's what I'm saying. Like when he compared, for example, Islamic Republic to Nazi regime, I think that just speaks volume, right? So the grieving for me, that's why you can imagine it was a very complex process for me, because it was at some point I was just thinking that, okay, I'm grieving over a father who didn't really even think about me, who didn't even really think about my family and what would happen to me. Growing up without a father, growing up in that suppressive society, you know, it just all those things, right? He was aware. And I think he was also maybe like so confident that I would be overprotected by family members and his friends and stuff, that unfortunately that did not happen either. Well, I don't want to sidetrack from that, but so the grieving was very complex. At some point, I couldn't initially separate these two, that, okay, he was an innocent man and he was basically a decent, very decent citizen of the society who had dedicated his life for better, like for a better society. You know, his ideology might have been wrong or misled or whatever, but the ideology was towards building a better society for the Iranians and the generation to come, right? So am I grieving the unjust death of that person, or am I grieving the death of my father, who was not really maybe a good father for me in terms of, you know, like fulfilling his responsibilities as a father, that you're supposed to, you know, just be there for your family, for your children and everything. So you can imagine from that perspective, my grieving was very complex. It required many counseling sessions and trying to mindfulness programs and everything, until I came to peace with the fact that it's not that my father chose death. He very much loved life, and that was just manifested in all the postcards and everything, the little gifts that during all those years that I was visiting in prison, it just manifested itself. I'm gonna come, I'm gonna tell you, oh, you're learning swimming, continue learning swimming, you don't need to learn English, I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna teach you English. He was also fluent in English, French, and German. So as we know, like the political prisoners in Iran all are educated, right? So, but I came to the peace with the fact that, okay, Solmaz, you have the right to be maybe angry with your father, but can you just put that aside for a fact and then think about this unjust treatment? Can you put yourself in his position? You know, a person who is in prison, who had a light sentence, who was just basically his only crime was in the possession of being some leaflets of their organization and believing in the ideology. And is it really just that this is happening in 21st century? Or like, this is not, we shouldn't get the same treatment. We shouldn't see the same capital punishment. We shouldn't see the same so-called like these sham trials that it used to exist during Middle Ages in Europe. But it was exactly like that, right? The questions that were asked in the death committee, they were ideological questions. It has nothing to do with like if you are active against Islamic Republic, because my father was saying that I would declare that I would not do that, right? Do you believe in Islam? Did you grow up in a family that believe in Islam? Even if you say yes, that's it, death penalty, apostasy, right? So it is, so for that reason, my grief was very complex, but eventually I came to I try to have peace with the fact that an innocent person, happened to be my father, was executed by this clerical regime in a most unjust way. And I need to be outspoken about it. I need to talk about it. And I need to share my story because this narrative, as Mani alluded to, is very important. That the more people are aware, the better it is. Not just Iranians. We have to have like our voice for the outreach, the communities out there. Everybody should know that, right? Because we are not, let's not forget that, for example, even today, well, they're not part of the European Union. In the continent of Europe, there's still two countries that very much have death penalty and executions. If not public executions, maybe throwing people out of the window, and that's Russia and Belarus, right? So, and it's alarming. Like Raha already like alluded to that, and like she shared all those stats. When I was just reading about it, that actual report also came from Amnesty International, that only in the first 4 months of 2025, it was like 75% increase in the death penalty compared to the year before, 2024, in Iran. So these are alarming. These are families. These all people have families, even criminals, right? Even criminals.
Canada has formally recognized the executions in the summer of 1988 as a crime against humanity, and
that is correct.
And I believe it's on September 1st that they
yes
commemorated.
Yes.
There's a question here in the Q&A box here from Mana Khosrowshahi. They ask, sociologically speaking, Raha, if you could tackle this, and then Mani, if you could take this on also. Sociologically speaking, what actions and programs should and could be undertaken to change public opinion about capital punishment? Basically, if a society wants capital punishment, how can we convince people to move away from it? Are there successful case studies in this regard? It's a great question.
It is very important for the civil society to have the freedom to organize anti-death penalty campaigns. In Iran, the Iranian authorities have not only executed hundreds of people every year, but they have criminalized opposition to the death penalty. For years now, we have documented the cases of human rights defenders who were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, like 10 years or 20 years, because of their human rights activism, including campaigning against the death penalty. In court verdicts, the authorities openly cited opposition to the death penalty as evidence of gathering and colluding against national security, or as insulting the principles of Islam. So we are talking in a context where the authorities do not want members of the public to hear about the impact or the positive impact of the abolition of the death penalty and how that can build a fair and more humane society. Despite their efforts, we actually see that the human rights movement in Iran has had massive achievements. Based on surveys that have been done, a significant portion of the Iranian society now is against the death penalty. We also have had a very powerful no to execution campaign that has echoed domestically and globally. It has touched the hearts of tens of thousands of people in Iran and around the world. We've had a brave, courageous struggle for the abolition of the death penalty from inside prison walls. with hundreds of prisoners in different prisons waging hunger strikes every Tuesday against the death penalty. And just recently, around, I think it was now 3 weeks ago, these videos went viral from Qezel Hisal prison that showed hundreds of prisoners holding no to execution signs and speaking up against this horrific execution spree that the Iranian authorities have been waging in prisons across the country. So we are speaking about a context where there has been a rise in public awareness of the need to abolish the death penalty. However, a lot more needs to be done. On the one hand, we need to raise greater awareness of the stories of people who end up on death row for drug-related offenses. We have noticed that when it comes to politically motivated executions against dissidents, the members of the public respond more positively to the need to abolish the death penalty. And when it comes to drug-related executions, the victims are sadly treated usually as numbers and figures. And the stories, the fact that they faced systemic poverty and marginalization, which led to their arrest and for drug-related offenses, is not seen. So it's important to invest more time in raising awareness and shedding light on the situation of the hundreds of people who are executed for drug-related offenses. When it comes to the use of the death penalty for murder under the principle of qisas, again, we've been saying for years that qisas leads to a culture of violence. It normalizes assaults on the right to life. It continues the cycle of violence and revenge in the society. We have seen many families who refuse to actually exercise the right that is granted to them under Iranian law to kill the person responsible for the death of their loved one. The problem, again, is the legal framework that forces families to choose between the death penalty or getting someone convicted of murder released after a few years. So there is not a proportionate penalty for murder that does not involve the death penalty. So a proper legal reform process needs to be initiated in order to ensure that murder is punishable by proportionate sentences that do not involve execution, which is the ultimate cruel and inhumane punishment. It's also important to, when it comes to also the possible support for the use of the death penalty in relation to those responsible for crimes under international law. And here I'm talking about officials who have engaged in crimes against humanity, including torture, murder, enforced disappearances, rape. There is massive public outrage that decades of crimes under international law have gone unpunished in the country. And there is little hope that those responsible would be held to account anytime soon. In this context, it's very important to indicate to the victims' communities in Iran that there could be a proper, fair justice mechanism to hold those responsible to account so that vengeful killings and retribution in kind is not seen as the only way to deal with this legacy of state violence. For this reason, we've been actually urging the international community to set up an investigative mechanism that can preserve evidence of these crimes with a view to future accountability efforts. We are calling on states around the world to exercise universal jurisdiction against those responsible for crimes under international law in Iran and to take every measure that they can in support of victims' calls for truth and justice. If these kinds of independent justice mechanisms are not pursued for victims' communities in Iran, it's it's very dangerous in a society that is reeling from such massive patterns of repression, because it leaves victims' communities without any hope that they could have a court, they could be heard in a court of law. And I just end on the same note that it's essential for people to be able to exercise their right to freedom of expression and association and assembly in the first place, so that they can organize against the death penalty, so that they can raise awareness about the impact that this cruel punishment has not only on those who spend years on death row, but also on their families and on the society as a whole. And let me mention also on the guards and prison officials that are involved in the machinery of death. We have also received testimonies over the years from this underheard community that's part of the machinery of repression, but also experiences the trauma that comes from inflicting death on people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Manijan, do you want to tackle this about what can be done to move a population away from being in favor of capital punishment?
Yeah, I think that's a very key question. Thank you, Rahajan, for elaborating on that. I think education definitely plays an important role. It depends who we are asking the question from. If it's like activists and political opposition or all of this, they need to find a way to mobilize people. And I believe it's a difficult job. It's difficult in this modern era that we are isolated. We are each in our own safe space, and some of us don't want to be exposed to new ideas. However, this is what needs to be done, and also in an individual level, in an individual capacity, we need to ask this from ourselves, because just imagine that I believe that I'm against execution, but I think that, okay, for this specific crime, execution is okay. And then you think that, no, this for another crime, quote unquote crime, execution is okay. And then another person, and collectively we are letting it to happen. We need to reflect upon the material that we are exposed to, why execution should not be there, why, even though it's painful, like for example, if somebody kills a kid, of course for the parents it's awful, and does really execution calm their pain? Does it really heal their pain? And having this sociological lens is very important to see that, no, it's not really. Actually, execution is not to eliminate crime. It's just a punishment to control, to create an order which benefits the system, not the individuals necessarily. If we think about that and elaborate on that and reflect on that, I think it can be done. Of course, it's difficult because when a governing system is there and is against such education, of course, it's difficult. And countering this education is easy for governing system. So hard work, I would say, and not getting disappointed, and continue to talk in an accessible language by reasoning what we believe in, not just to repeat it, but by reasoning, discussing it, and being open to listen the opposing ideas, that some people that are okay with execution, okay, we need to listen why they are okay with that. And then as educators and activists and as social movement, we can engage in a dialogue and then reason the people who are okay with that.
Manijan, you cut your talk short, the section that you were going to do on Iran. Do you want to go ahead with that at this point? You're muted. You're muted. Oh, great. Screen sharing.
Yeah, I try to keep it brief, and then we come back to Q&A. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay, the Iranian context, execution as governance, discipline, and social ordering. In the Iranian context, execution sentencing functions through 2 interconnected channels: political control and moral legal regulation. Although these are often discussed separately, political cases versus non-political cases, sociologically, they serve the same purpose: upholding a particular social order defined by the state. First, I look at non-political executions as a system of managing marginalized populations. Iran consistently ranks among the highest execution rates in the world, as Rahajan said, and the majority of these sentences are officially categorized as non-political, such as drug-related offenses, homicide, sexual offenses, moral crimes, including zina, same-sex acts, and etc., and economic crimes. However, sociology invites us to look deeper. Maybe this part can be a part of that answer to that question. Sociology invites us to look deeper. These non-political executions overwhelmingly affect people from impoverished regions, ethnic minorities, Kurds, Baluch, Ahwazi Arabs, individuals with minimal legal representation, people struggling with addiction, informal laborers, and migrants. The patterns show that the death penalty becomes a method of governing socioeconomic marginality. It is less about the act itself and more about disciplining those who already occupy vulnerable social positions. In this sense, non-political executions normalize the state's authority and reinforce moral boundaries around purity, obedience, and social conformity. I want to go back to that question and say that this is an example that we need to be against execution when we think that that crime is okay. We justify execution for specific crimes. That is the time that we need to wake up, give ourselves a wake-up call. For example, in Iran, many people are okay when Afghan migrants are being executed. This is exactly the time that we need to talk about it, that no, it's not okay. It's against another person. As Solma said, it's not important what their belief is, what their political orientation is, what their sexual orientation, what their ethnicity is. No, it's against a human being, so it should not be done, and then make our argument based on that. And then for political executions as a mechanism for suppressing dissent and asserting sovereignty. Political cases, including charges such as muharebe, enmity against God, fasad fil arz, corruption on earth, acting against national security, protest-related offenses, highlight the explicitly political function of execution. These sentences serve several sociological purposes. Deterrence, which is signaling to society that dissent has existential consequences. Then a spectacle of sovereignty, demonstrating that the state's power is not negotiable. Moral framing, representing political resistance as a spiritual or moral threat, not merely a political disagreement. Boundary enforcement, defining who is a loyal citizen and who is an outsider, a threat, or moral contaminant. In this way, political executions are part of the state's toolkit for maintaining ideological dominance and discouraging collective action. And then the connection between these two, everyday repression versus exceptional repression. Sociologically, the line between political and non-political execution is not as sharp as it appears. Political executions produce fear and obedience at the national level. Non-political executions produce order by managing marginalized communities and reinforcing moral and legal authority at the everyday level. Together, they serve a single system of governance built on discipline, deterrence, moral control, and the ritual performance of state power. Executions rise during period of crisis. A sociologically important pattern in Iran is that execution rates, both political and non-political, as Rahajan said, tend to increase during political unrest, economic deterioration, protests, and moments of legitimacy crisis. This suggests that the execution sentencing is particularly used to reassert authority, resort symbolic power, and manage social anxiety. And then we have symbolic message of execution. In Iran, the symbolic message of execution, whether political or non-political, is unmistakable. The state defines morality, identity, and order, and it retains the ultimate right to enforce them. This symbolic function is as important as the legal function. End of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mani-Jan. We actually have a question for you. Regimes behave as you have described in order to achieve and retain legitimacy. How have regimes of this sort lost that legitimacy? So again, another question about solutions. You know, how do you make such a regime lose its legitimacy?
Samira Jan, any dictatorship is bound to be demolished from the existence time, because it contradicts itself, it contradicts the society, it contradicts the life. So when we look at Iran as an example, the Islamic regime in Iran, in the beginning, people hated the previous regime. Many people, maybe most of the people, hated the previous regime. And for example, army commanders and all of this. So the regime started with executing these people first from the beginning. So many people had sympathy with the Iranian regime because they saw these people as criminals, and they thought that, okay, they need to be killed. They don't need to exist. They don't have the right to exist. They don't deserve life. And then this is how it happened to legitimize it. But then it was not limited to that. Then it became to women. Then it became to gay people. Then it became to minorities, ethnicities. So more people were subject of this act, of this brutal act. And then at some point, people start to figure out that, oh, this is happening to all of us. This is going to be a policy. This is going to be a norm. This is going to be a routine of this regime. So we need to do something. And slowly we lost our trust in the ideology of the regime. And this is the start of a fall, I believe.
I remember there was a poll done, and it showed that more than 80% of people in Iran are, if you would ask them if they want an Islamic Republic today, the answer would be no.
Yeah.
And I think that people didn't quite understand what living under these types of laws would actually mean.
And many of these people believed in reform many years ago.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
they were against even revolution.
Yes.
Because of the experience of Islamic revolution, that we thought that, oh, all revolution is going to be like that. Many of us were against a revolution, and we believed in reform. And so, but now we have turned into being against the regime, the fundamental of the regime.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, though, about the political environment, because Solmaz, maybe you could speak to this a little bit. I noticed that when you were speaking about, you know, what had happened to your father, you said maybe, you know, you're not ideologically aligned. And right now, the political environment, really, as we see it, a lot of people are blaming leftists. A lot of people are, you know, using them as scapegoats. And there is this sense, as you pointed out, Mani, that like sometimes, you know, if they're killing Afghan migrants, people are like, well, that's okay. Or if they're killing someone who's accused of sexual assault or something like that, everyone's, well, that's all right. I don't mind. You know, how do you develop a sort of all-encompassing no to all for, you know, no to execution for everyone? That seems to be a very difficult thing to tackle. Do you want to speak to that, Raha or Mani, or Solmaz even? Do you want to take that on?
I can start, and then I can also definitely Raha and Mani. They're more actually. They're the subject matter experts, definitely more than me. But that's a great question. Actually, that is a very good question. So, as again, Mani also mentioned, we have to educate basically our community, our people, the society, and oh my goodness, that cute. Okay, sorry, I love animals, so I get distracted. But okay, so we have to come to terms with the fact that, are we against execution or not? So either we are against execution, and then we say no to execution, and we work towards the abolition of any kind of death penalty and execution, or no, we cannot say, okay, for this crime is okay, for that crime is okay. And I think you're right. You actually absolutely nailed it. You said the most difficult task, like the most difficult thing to tackle, is that how we're going to change like that way of thinking in Iran. Because unfortunately, what I see is, and again, as you mentioned, yes, for the longest time, many Iranians, including sometimes even my friends, like right in front of my eyes, they had said that, oh, lefties made a revolution, they brought this misery upon us, they deserve to be killed. So I had heard that millions and millions of times, like read, like in social media and everything. The reality is, the revolution was wrong. Now we know, after like 45 years of misery, right? I don't think nobody can deny that. So, but you have to also consider, we have to go back. The mindset of the people and the intellectuals of 45, 46, 47 years ago was very different than now. We're talking about the era that Islamic fundamentalism was really not an issue at that time yet, okay? And in fact, everything started with the Iranian Revolution, I would say. And then, other things like, Soviet Union attacking Afghanistan and so many of the aftermath of that. But I don't want to get into all those discussions, and because it deviates us from what we're focusing on. But it's just this blaming that, unfortunately, if I want to allude to like someone cultural flaw among Iranians, that we're always looking for someone to blame, this happened to us, they did this. So there are even some Iranians that still believe that the Iranian Revolution 1979 was orchestrated by the West, which is not true. It's not based on facts. Yes, Democrats were kind of against Shah and all that. Maybe Carter didn't do anything in his to prevent the revolution, but it was not orchestrated by them. And lefties, the reality is, yes, all those organizations with the communist ideologies from Tudeh, Fadayan Khalq, and everything, minority, majority, they had a significant role in the revolution, way more than Islamists. Everyone knows that. So, like Mujahideen Khalq, lefties. But the idea was to bring democracy. Nobody had seen what was going to happen. And when the ones that still stood up against the regime after, when they had a wake up call, oh, no, wait a second. Looks like this is worse than what we had before. Okay, maybe Iran was politically a dictatorship under Shah, but we had social freedom. We had women's rights. We were on the right path. The society was still like on the right path, and it was becoming a progressive society, especially at least in the context of Middle East when we're talking about. I'm not comparing, we shouldn't compare ourselves to Sweden or France. But okay, so what happened was, yes, this blame thing is there, but until like we don't work on this raising awareness and having, I think, more and more of these panels, and we talk about and also encourage people, especially Iranians, to read. Okay, so you have to know, you have to read about other like tragedies in other countries. It's not only in Iran, right? Like look at even Russia, like what's happening even today in Russia, right? Read about Belarus, read about Chile under Pinochet, like, I don't know, like read about what happened in the former communist countries, I don't know, in Cambodia, in like, I don't know, like Vietnam, in, like all those like dictatorships, like because the executions like have always been used, as a way of, like creating fear, obedience, and everything, either political or not politically. So we have to come to this agreement. And then if we think about it and we read more about it and we read more stories of also like the personal stories of the loved ones, and then when we can come to the conclusion that even for other crimes or petty crimes or killings or any other things, robbery, you name it, qisas, the retaliatory punishment, is a barbaric law, because you basically put the destiny of the person. Let's say, okay, it's awful, as Mani again said. Like, let's say I have like one of my loved ones gets killed by somebody. Like, I'm emotionally charged I'm dealing with loss. I have lost my loved one. And then you're going to put like instead of having in a democratic society, you have law and order, you have laws, you have regulations. If you want to put the destiny of that person, the killer, in my hand, that's not going to work. That's why lately, I have to say, I've seen some positive things in Iran. Sorry that I'm talking too much. I think this is the last thing to say, but there have been so many movies. Like there has been culturally, basically, they're trying to tackle this. So many movies in Iran have been made lately, recently, over the past, I would say like 15, 20 years, which is about qisas, like negative aspects of qisas, right?
Yes, I've seen it in a lot of films.
Yeah. You see, like there are, well, of course, the political thing, they still cannot do it. It's a flag, it's a red line. They cannot cross that. That's a boundary that unfortunately they cannot cross. But in other parts that they have, and it's like just more like opening up the side. Unfortunately, you're right, because when I had even friends that when I was speaking with, they said, "Oh, but you're completely forgetting the family of the victim." I'm like, no. But you don't understand the cycle of violence that this creates, like if you're pro execution.
And Raha, you spoke to that a little bit too, this sort of cycle and the difficulty in breaking that. Do you want to tackle this question? I know that you have to go, so I appreciate you staying with us as long as you can, but just tackle this question about what, and now I forgot the question.
Yeah.
Here, let me read the question to you again. It was about the legitimacy, how you make a government such as the one we have in Iran lose legitimacy with the people. And I know that polls have shown, and we can see it even amongst the people and among our own work that we do, that legitimacy has fallen. But how do you expand that into like the global community?
Sorry, before I address that, I think there was also a question on how to make the society oppose the death penalty in all circumstances so that it's not dependent on the nature of the
of course. I'm
crime or the
sorry.
profile.
It was about
Accused.
not just having it pertain to one group or another. That was the question.
I'll be happy to
one
answer
before.
also the second question you asked. But just on this issue, I think we need to keep emphasizing without any hesitation that the sanctity of human life must be recognized. Everyone must be urged to accept that people have like inherent dignity simply by virtue of being human. And when this principle is upheld, then it becomes evident that no institution, no authority has the moral legitimacy to deliberately take a human life, regardless of the nature of the charges or the crimes involved. We obviously always recall or remind people that the death penalty has no deterrent effect whatsoever compared to other punishments. But it's also important to not just speak in consequential terms and focus on this moral issue of the sanctity of human life. No state must be allowed to inflict irreversible harm. We know that judicial systems are prone to error, discrimination, and coercion. So there is always a risk of people being innocently convicted. But even if someone has actually committed a crime and that is proven in a fair, credible trial, human beings must not be reduced to their crimes. Their dignity as humans must be still recognized, and the death penalty does the exact opposite. It dehumanizes the person's sentence and reduces them to their crimes rather than recognizing their inherent dignity. And through this process, it basically allows the state and perhaps the society also to inflict painful, severe suffering on that individual and on their family. Sorry, my battery is also running out. Yeah, so basically it normalizes state violence, lethal violence. And the very purpose of justice is to protect life and dignity, not to destroy it. I think one other thing that I like to mention is that retaining the death penalty, especially at a scale that we've seen in Iran, normalizes other forms of state-inflicted killings as well. So in Iran, we don't have just a death penalty crisis. We have basically a crisis of arbitrary deprivation of life across multiple fronts: deaths in custody, acts of torture that lead to death, killings of protesters, killings of um, uh, Kurdish kulbars and Baluchi sukhbars, which are the fuel porters from the Baluchi community. We have killings of Afghan refugees who crossed the border. Basically, there is a crisis of attacks on the right to life because the state has sought to justify taking life, not only through judicial execution, but also through other forms of lethal violence by security forces. When there is impunity and a veil of legality for taking away human life under judicial sentences, then there remains always a risk for this attack on the right to life to be broadened and include other forms of state-inflicted killings as well. When societies understand the sanctity of human life as a foundational value, then they can recognize that the death penalty, along with all other forms of state killings, are always incompatible with human rights, justice, and human dignity. Um, Many countries have already won this battle. Iran, along with 17 other countries, are the last countries that usually execute people every year. So the number of states that retain the death penalty in law is more than that, but they still constitute um, a very small minority. Two-thirds of countries around the world have abolished the death penalty in law or practice, but year after year, only 18 to 20 countries actually carry out death sentences. And amongst them, Iran, with some other countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, are the ones carrying.
I think we may have lost Raha. She pointed out that her battery was running out. Yeah, I think we have. I mean, I think that what she was saying about the member states that still have um, the death penalty leads really nicely into a question that we have about countries. And the question is, should a country be considered a human rights leader if it still uses the death penalty? I think that's a good broad question. What do you think about that, Mani? Should a country that still has the death penalty really be talking about human rights and dignity of life? I can think of the United States, for instance, who sees itself as a freedom fighting government and tells governments around the world what to do. Should they be considered a leader in human rights when they have the death penalty?
No. It's
In short,
for
no.
me, in short, no. And it's not only, I think this is a pattern of all dictators in every form, traditional or upgraded ones, that they think that they can be, and even they are leaders, and everybody is looking at them. You see how they call themselves. For example, in Iran, they call it the Vali Amr Muslimin Jahan. And, there are just,
Can you give us a translation of that? Give us
oh
a
my God, yeah, the Vali Amr. I don't know. You do it. You have a better English.
Valley meaning ruler,
Vali means the, yeah, guardian.
guardian or guide, a guide to all the Muslim beings in the world.
Yeah, and even they are Shiites. Khomeini is Shiite, so
Yeah.
it's even a small portion of Muslims are Shiites. So, but he still calls himself the guide, the guardian
For
of
all
all
Muslims.
Muslims. Yeah.
Yes.
So all of them are like that. No, I don't think that. If you are referring to the new arrangements in UN, I think that it's a shameful show. It's actually a good learning opportunity for future generations. That we had this show that a country with execution sentencing in practice is head of a specific group in UN or any other place. So no, I don't think that they need to. They can lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the history has shown us that they are actually not leading. These are the intellectuals who are working to make a better life for everyone, have the access to the resources equal for everyone, are actually leading. Or so far it has been like that. I don't know how social media is going to change it in the long term, but so far the history has shown that no, the real ones, the real leaders are the ones who think about humanity to improve it, not to demolish it.
We have about 12 to 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask um, for just some closing statements on what you think in terms of moving forward. I mean, this is our 9th session. We've spoken about the ideological frameworks of the death penalty, the sociological frameworks. We've touched upon and have had very moving narratives over the past year. And and I think one of the things that was really important that Mani brought up and Solmaz actually spoke to and Raha also is putting a face and a name to all of these deaths is so important because a lot of times we just hear statistics. Iran has killed 1,000 people so far in 2025. And particularly with the people that it's killing for drug offenses. We don't hear about their stories. I want to ask you about the impact of that, and then ask each of you to give maybe a minute or a 2-minute closing statement on what you want people to leave with when it comes to the sociological perspectives on the death penalty. Can I
Sure,
start with
Samira Jan,
you,
but as
Raha?
Raha is back,
Oh,
and
she's
I
back.
know that she now wants to leave, if she wants to give the closing statement, please, Raha Jan, feel free to.
Thank you, Mani John. I just wanted to apologize that I suddenly got disconnected.
Oh,
I
that's
think
okay.
I said everything that I could think of in terms of how to basically insist on this sanctity of human life, and I hope that we can generate more global solidarity with this uh, population that is constantly at risk of execution, death, and injury when they exercise their right to freedom of expression and association. When it comes to executions for drug related offenses, it's absolutely important to remember that this execution crisis is also linked to historic discrimination against Iran's oppressed ethnic minorities, particularly the Baluchi minority. It's important to remember the root causes of their poverty and marginalization that leads to this disproportionate impact of drug related executions on them, and to advocate for a criminal justice system that's rooted in respect for human dignity and rehabilitation for all people. And that our struggle for human rights is not just limited to dissidents and political prisoners, but also all victims of human rights violations in Iran. I hope that's the message that people take with them. And I urge you to check the Iran page of Amnesty International. We have an ongoing urgent action for the execution crisis in the country. And as I said, it's only through global pressure and solidarity that we can exert enough pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran and their authorities to halt this horrific execution crisis. Thanks again, and wishing you all the best in the new year.
Thank you, Raha Jan.
Bye.
Bye. Samira, I think it's very important what you ask now, and also what you asked before is very important. I'm trying to link them together and answer the question. When you have a sociological lens in your hand and you want to look at what happened, you do not try to find who was at fault, whose responsibility it was. You just see at what happened and analyze what happened. Analyze that who did what. In In addition to that, I believe that history is there for us to learn our lessons, but at the end, we need to move forward. I don't see lefties or anybody else responsible for what Khomeini and his regime did. As an example, just one example of tens of massacres and murders, 1988 massacre in Evin prison was just Khomeini and his regime's fault. It was not leftists, it was not Mujahideen's fault, it was not nationalists' faults. We need to address and name the proper. And by doing this, we are going to focus on solutions. When we do this, we are going to focus on solutions. What's the use of, I call you, I don't know, fascist, you call me Panjo Hafti or lefty, accusing each other. What's going to happen? Just the dictator system just is going to remain there, maintain itself, and get powerful. So focusing on future, focusing on what happened and how happened, and then trying to find solutions, which is not, of course, the responsibility of a sociological lens. But this is I think this needs to be done. Without that sociological solution and being open to absorb the analysis that we read or we are exposed to, change is not going to happen. As a social justice educator here, I want to have this. For me, social justice definition is very simple. Having equal access to the resources, which means, what does it mean? It means that we are 30 people here in this room, and there are only 20 bottles of water. So limitedness of resources is a fact. Water, money, air, soil, all of these resources that we have are limited. So when we talk about social justice and we are focusing on giving a specific group access to specific resources, as social justice warriors, we need to remember that we are creating inequality somewhere else, So this is the nature of social justice. Conflict is part of social justice, and we cannot find an exact point on which we stand and say that, okay, this is justice. No. In that moment, actually, that is the point that you are going to reproduce discrimination, reproduce injustice. Because it's like surfing waves. You know how surfers change their position all the time? I think social justice activists, educators, warriors, whoever is focusing on social justice, we need to change our position all the time because we cannot reach to a point. Social justice is just an ideal. We are not supposed to reach to it. We are supposed to get ideas from it and change our policies. It can be organization, it can be political groups, it can be environmental groups, governments, all of them need to update their policies based on this idea. So we need to set aside our prejudices, whatever we learned about what we want, and get together and then be exposed to these analysis, sociological, psychological analysis, narratives that are being presented to us. And this way, we can first acknowledge pain. Secondly, now I'm turning into a social worker. Sorry, I have, I'm traveling into roles. So this way, we can first acknowledge pain and then find out that this pain can also apply to me one day. Martin Niemöller's quote is very, very fascinating, that when they came for me, there was no one to speak for me. So that's what happened. I don't know if I lost the track of your question or if I answered to it.
No, I think you framed it very well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
so. Yeah. I don't know if Solmaz wants to add anything or.
Yeah, I mean, I think Solmaz, if you could speak to this question, and then also just to wrap up, I think it would be nice. We started with you, and we'd end with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I can definitely say that one of the basically the as like a responsibility by activists, I would say the more narratives and stories of those the families, of the victims that are heard, I think that the more impactful this would be, and maybe even in the context of just death penalty as it's like, and it's like as a legal term, and its sociological impact, and it's also a human impact. And I think the more stories are like this held, and if we can maybe like the outreach could be expanded, for example, to the families. I know that it's hard, but like, for example, the ones that have lost their family members, for example, to the Islamic like qisas, or to, I don't know, those minorities, for example, like Kurdish and like Sistan, like Baluchs, and we know that these are all disproportionately basically affected by the capital punishment, as both Mani and Raha also alluded to. So I think the more stories that we have, the more awareness, the more education, I think that we would definitely get in positive basic results from that. And let's just not forget, like I really liked also, I would also like to wrap up and with this quote from this American writer, Clint Smith, that the death penalty not only takes away the life of a person that is strapped to a table, but it also takes a bit of the humanity in each of us. Like it's a very deep quote. Like if there is a humanity in us, like even me, myself, I've lost my father, but I don't want death penalty for the person who's even, well, the person who's related is already dead, has been dead for many years, but other perpetrators, I don't want the death penalty. I just want a fair trial in a democratic society. So that's the kind of, that's when its justice is served. I do not wish to have death penalty, even for the person who's responsible for my father's death.
Bravo.
Wow, I hope we can all get to that place, Solmaz Can. It's the ideal point to reach. I just want to, for the last couple minutes that we have, this is a reminder that our last session in this series will be held on December 10th. We'll be marking Human Rights Day, and we look forward to our final discussion. I really want to thank Solmaz, Mani, and Raha for joining us. This was great discussion, and we hope that you can, you're not going to be panelists, but we hope that you can tune in, ask questions on December 10th. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you. Okay.
Of course, Samira Jan, thank you. I also want to close with this statement that execution sentencing is not simply a legal decision. It's a social act. It reveals how a society understands justice, how it constructs moral boundaries, how it uses punishment to maintain order, and how deeply inequality shapes our notions of who deserves to live or die. And it's very important to focus on the word society, system. We are also part of the society. We are also part of the system. Even if we are being subjected to torture, to discrimination, to execution, we are also part of the system. So we can be effective in changing or maintaining the status quo. It's not easy, definitely, but we need to change at least our mindset about execution and say, no, not even to my beloved murderer, no execution. Thank you very much. I believe that these are very invaluable material that you are creating. It was an honor to be part of this panel.
I think that just to leave on this point, that Mani you brought up, it's very important that we all see our role in that society, in that system, and how we can act as a bulwark. So thank you to all of you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.